Next on Link TV, Latin polls, news and analysis from Latin America as seen by Latin American media, followed by a panel discussion on the issues. Next on Latin polls, only on Link TV.
The following program is an original production of Link TV.
Yo sé que estamos haciendo mal por entrar a este país ilegalmente, pero no somos unos delincuentes.
Latin American immigrants send home almost as much money as their countries exporting goods and services. With this kind of incentive, will illegal immigration ever be stopped?
Quieren hacer aparecer eso como si hubiera sido muertos de civiles en el Ecuador, lo cual nosotros rechazamos.
And border conflicts, a way of life in Latin America or a way of diverting public opinion away from the real issues? This and more coming up on Latin Pulse. Hello and welcome to Pulso Latino. I'm your host, Marcos Gutierrez.
Yo no he roto ninguna ley, no he hecho nada, solamente he venido aquí para trabajar.
Our first topic tonight, illegal immigration has come back to the forefront of U.S. public opinion as it does in every election cycle.
Somos 13 millones de personas que no vivimos una vida feliz.
This time, politicians on both sides of the scale are bent on providing some kind of solution on illegal immigration.
Estamos pagando impuestos, trabajando duro. A veces trabajamos hasta 100 horas y a veces no es justo que no tengamos cualquier cosa.
The problem is, as long as immigrants send home billions of dollars of revenue, the issue may never be resolved. We'll go in-depth on the subject tonight. Thousands of people are detained daily along the U.S.-Mexican border trying to enter the United States illegally. This year, though, there has been a reduction in the number of arrests made by the Border Patrol. This in part due to the additional resources that have been deployed along the border to deter the entry of these immigrants, mostly from Latin America, as we see in this report from Latinoamérica TV. Notice how this U.S.-based broadcaster used the footage from Iraq to illustrate the story about the border.
Desde el 1 de octubre al 31 de marzo, agentes de la patrulla limítrofe realizaron 418.184 arrestos en el linde sur de Estados Unidos, comparado con las 594.142 detenciones del mismo periodo durante el año anterior, según sostuvo la Agencia de Protección de Aduanas y Fronteras del gobierno de Washington. La entidad atribuyó la baja al aumento de las medidas de seguridad, entre las que se incluye la construcción de vallas adicionales en límite y el despliegue de unos 6.000 efectivos de la Guardia Nacional para apoyar a la Policía de Fronteras. El año pasado, la patrulla fronteriza arrestó a cerca de 1.1 millón de personas que cruzaban los ríos y desiertos de la frontera de 3.200 kilómetros. La mayoría de los detenidos eran mexicanos y centroamericanos que buscan trabajo en Estados Unidos.
It's hard to tell if the Iraq footage on that report was utilized on purpose or by mistake. What is true, though, is that for a news organization, it was highly inaccurate. As the U.S. presidential election intensifies, so does the battle against illegal immigration. This issue seems to follow the U.S. political cycle. Mexico's Canal 11 reports that this time President Bush is suggesting immigrants bring crime along with them.
Bush calificó a la migración indocumentada como un problema serio que debe ser afrontado agresivamente y lo relacionó con la criminalidad.
Yo sé que estamos haciendo mal por entrar a este país ilegalmente, pero no somos unos delincuentes, simplemente queremos una vida mejor para nuestras familias.
Incarceration of criminals who are here illegally strains the Arizona budget, but there's a lot of other ways it strains the local and state budgets. It brings crime to our communities.
El año pasado los republicanos bloquearon la aprobación de una reforma migratoria. Irónicamente, un Congreso con mayoría demócrata podría ser más receptivo a la propuesta de Bush. Sin embargo, el presidente se encuentra en la etapa final de su mandato, con una popularidad a la baja y un Congreso dividido a causa del financiamiento de la guerra en Irak y la posible retirada de las tropas. 11 Noticias, Araceli Nava.
The president has proposed a 5-pronged plan to legalize illegal immigrants already in the United States and improve the immigration process. It is also deploying more troops and resources along the border, as we hear in this report from U.S. Spanish broadcaster Inmigración.
De acuerdo a la vocera de la patrulla fronteriza, la presencia de los militares, la tecnología, el muro fronterizo han contribuido a reducir el flujo de indocumentados en esa región en casi 30%.
Han bajado mucho las personas tratando de cruzarse y las aprehensiones, como lo dije anteriormente, han bajado 60%.
Y se espera que se duplique el número de agentes de la patrulla fronteriza para el 2008, agregando más barreras y así disminuir el número de indocumentados que entran al país. La propuesta para una reforma migratoria del presidente George W. Bush incluye que los que quieran legalizar su estatus migratorio deban de aprender inglés y pagar altas multas. Y ahora espera que los republicanos y los demócratas se pongan de acuerdo para sacar de las sombras a los más de 12 millones de indocumentados que viven y trabajan en Estados Unidos. Desde la frontera Arizona con México, Víctor Hugo Rodríguez, Univisión.
At this time, the plan is being debated in Congress, but many say that the illegal immigration issue will never be resolved as long as money is being sent by immigrants back to their countries. This seems to be a big incentive to literally export people to the United States, but as we hear in the next report from Mexico's Once Noticias, it is also one of the biggest foreign aid programs in the world.
Las remesas que enviaron los latinoamericanos que residen fuera de su lugar de origen superaron los 62.000 millones de dólares en el 2006, cifra que representa un incremento anual de más de 14%, informó el Banco Interamericano de Desarrollo.
El envío de remesas es probablemente el programa de reducción de pobreza más efectivo en Latinoamérica. 20 millones de familias superan la línea de pobreza en la región debido a las remesas. Ahora sabemos que las remesas son mucho más que toda la inversión extranjera directa, toda la asistencia oficial para el desarrollo y toda la ayuda internacional combinadas.
México fue el país que más entradas registró en la región, con más de una tercera parte del total, y alrededor del 75% de los flujos provinieron de Estados Unidos. El organismo internacional pronosticó que las remesas sumarán 100.000 millones de dólares para el 2010 debido al alto potencial que existe con las nuevas prácticas y comisiones en la banca privada.
And with us to discuss these issues, we have journalist Patricia Mercado, a Knight International Fellow at Stanford University, and from Washington, D.C., we're joined by Manuel Orozco, a Senior Associate at the Inter-American Dialogue, and Rick Rockwell, Professor of Communications at the American University. The billions of dollars sent home by immigrants to Latin America seems to be a big incentive not to solve the problem. Or is it, Mr. Orozco?
Definitely, immigrants are sending last year $62 billion, and that reinforces the reality that is the increasing integration between the United States and Latin America. There is a demand for foreign labor that in turn leads to increased volume of remittances. The issue is, how do you address the increased volume of migrants that has been coming and whose needs has not been addressed in terms of their legal status?
I wanted to ask Patricia about something that worries us a lot, and that is how it affects, how those remesas affect Latin American countries.
I think the remittances are helping to the families who are in the Latin American countries, and I think it's not a completely different thing, the remittances, from the immigration problem. I think the immigration problem is a big problem not only for Latin American countries but for the US. And if among these countries doesn't exist a very real agreement on how to solve the immigration problem, the remittances will still go into the Latin America. They are helping the families there, but I think it's not the big issue, the big issue for the countries. And for me, it's a shame to know that the second most important source of money in Mexico, who is coming from foreign countries, is the remittances after the oil. It's very ashamed to know that $20 billion every year is they are going to Mexico to help the families to solve many problems they have, but I think it's not the way for a country to develop.
Central Americans sometimes criticize Mexicans here in the United States for demanding better immigration policy when in Mexico itself, Central Americans are not treated properly. I'd like to ask Mr. Rick Rockwell, who's a professor of communication at the American University of Washington, D.C., to comment on this a little bit. What are the other problems that other Latin American countries have with immigration?
Well, I think you're correct that we see that on the southern border of Mexico that there are problems with people coming across from Guatemala, from El Salvador, elsewhere in Central America, and they're not treated with respect the same way that Mexicans are asking for that sort of respect in the United States. But I think the type of problems that we have are the same as what was mentioned about Mexico, is that these countries, Salvador, Guatemala, others, are exporting people. And as was said, that's not the way to develop a country and a country's economics.
Obviously, we have differences between how we think about it in Latin America and in the United States. Señor Manuel Orozco, I wanted to ask you, is there a silver bullet that we should be looking for?
The silver bullet is precisely a strategy of development that increases the integration between the United States and Latin America and at the same time increases growth and wealth distribution for many of the Latin American countries. As long as that doesn't happen, the region will continue to flow to the United States. There are cultural messages and economic messages that the U.S. sends to Latin America saying that if you cannot make it there, you can come here. So the problem is more complex than simply an issue of immigration reform, but it has to do with the opportunities that are created in Latin America.
I think the problems are development in the Latin American countries, and if you don't have opportunities, if you don't have economic growth, then the people will find another ways to have a better life. And the way that they are finding is coming to the United States. I think the example of Europe and how Europe solved this problem, the immigration problem, when they were starting the Union, is a very good point, because the big countries, the richest countries in Europe, when they wanted to integrate Portugal, Spain, and Greece, they decide to give money to these countries and to help them to build infrastructure and to give them opportunities for education. And then the people stop going to countries, for instance, from Spain to France, because they found the same opportunities in their country.
I don't think there is a straight relationship between migration and free trade, but definitely when you look at the case of Mexico, in some places where rural migration has occurred are the same areas where corn production declined after the signing of the free trade agreement with the United States and Canada. And you see a series of areas in Oaxaca, Jalisco, and other states of Mexico where there is a strong relationship between migration and the consequence of corn production. Mexicans started importing more corn from the United States right after the free trade agreement. So there is a relationship, but it depends on certain sectors of the economy. That might have an effect also in Central America, depending on how Central America integrates with the United States commercially.
So I want to ask you one last question, Señor Manuel Orozco. Is it then good business for Latin American countries to be sending out workers to the United States so they can send the large amounts of money that they send back?
People leave because they cannot take care of their families in their home country. And it's really cruel for many people to have to face the hardship to stay apart from their families. So there is no business in it. Of course, there are impacts that the flow of money have, and that in many ways are being leveraged to expand development opportunities. But that's a completely different issue.
Señor Manuel Orozco, thank you very much for being with us. Ladies and gentlemen, Mr. Orozco, Senior Associate, Inter-American Dialogue. Border conflicts between Latin American countries seem to be a way of life in Latin America, or are they a way of diverting public opinion away from the real issues? We will take a closer look at that subject and continue our panel discussions about Latin American issues in a moment. Historically, Latin America has had a border conflict between neighboring countries. Some say they are created by the media to divert public opinion from the real issues. Others say that they're created by governments that need to consolidate their weak political basis. The latest of these conflicts seem to be brewing between Colombia and Ecuador over the spraying of coca plantation along their common border, as we see in this report from Colombia's RCN.
El presidente Rafael Correa ratificó la decisión frente a las avionetas que esparcen el glifosato y violan el espacio aéreo de su país.
He dado la orden que si esos aviones vuelven a incursionar en territorio ecuatoriano sean interceptados por nuestra Fuerza Aérea, porque más aún, para dar la vuelta, se meten a nuestro territorio.
El mandatario se refirió a las aeronaves que realizan las tareas de fumigación. Recordó que pertenecen a una empresa estadounidense.
Las fumigaciones con glifosato, parte del Plan Colombia, en la frontera Ecuador-Colombia, que tantos años nos han hecho, ni siquiera le hacen aviones colombianos, sino aviones norteamericanos de DINCORP, mercenarios, ¿no?
Precisamente en la frontera, el alto comisionado de Naciones Unidas para los Refugiados, Antonio Gutiérrez, dijo que el número de desplazados es más alto del que se conoce y que dentro y fuera de Colombia son más de 3.500.000 personas las que se han visto obligadas a abandonar sus hogares.
But the friction between Colombia and Ecuador seems to be escalating, and not necessarily because of the aerial spraying. Colombia is now accusing Ecuador of harboring leftist guerrillas that seek refuge when fleeing from the Colombian military.
Según el ministro de Defensa, Juan Manuel Santos, el caso en el que supuestamente 2 guerrilleros murieron en territorio ecuatoriano no tiene fundamento.
Allá dicen que el ejército colombiano dio de baja 2 ecuatorianos en el otro lado de la frontera. Las investigaciones que se han hecho por parte nuestra dicen que eso no es cierto, que es todo lo contrario. Se hicieron 2 bajas de 2 guerrilleros en el lado colombiano y que después aparecieron en el lado ecuatoriano, pero eso se está investigando.
Sin embargo, el canciller Fernando Araujo aseguró que se está recolectando toda la información del caso.
La Fiscalía hizo los levantamientos de cadáver en territorio colombiano, que los familiares de los muertos reclamaron los cadáveres y luego los trasladaron a Ecuador y han hecho aparecer, o quieren hacer aparecer eso como si hubiera sido muertos de civiles en el Ecuador, lo cual nosotros rechazamos.
Sin embargo, los 2 gobiernos, tanto Ecuador como Colombia, intercambiarán documentos en los próximos días para aclarar este hecho.
Ecuador insists that the Colombian military illegally violated their territory by crossing the border to commit what they've called a crime. One of the most renowned territorial conflicts in Latin America has to be the Argentinian invasion of the Falkland Islands, followed by the British military response to reclaim them. Political observers in and outside of Argentina claimed the invasion was a way to rally the Argentinian public behind their unpopular and weakening military dictatorship. If that was the case, the plan backfired. The dictatorship fell and democracy returned to Argentina a few months after losing the war and the islands. Almost 1,000 young men on both sides died during the brief war in 1982. Those men are being remembered and honored by the Argentinian government 25 years after the end of that particular conflict.
El vicepresidente argentino, Daniel Scioli, representó al presidente Néstor Kirchner, que desistió de participar a última hora de la ceremonia y permaneció en su provincia natal de Santa Cruz, al norte de Ushuaia. No se explicó el motivo de la ausencia presidencial. La referencia del vicepresidente a los llamados internacionales aludió a las recomendaciones anuales que viene efectuando desde 1965 la Asamblea General de las Naciones Unidas para que los gobiernos de Londres y Buenos Aires emprendan negociaciones sobre la descolonización del archipiélago.
Another ongoing territorial conflict in Latin America has been that one between Chile and Peru. Both countries went to war 128 years ago when Peru entered the War of the Pacific between Bolivia and Chile in support of Bolivia. Today, Peru claims rights over thousands of kilometers of territorial waters in the Pacific Ocean, and some Peruvian politicians are making political hay out of it.
Alerta están en el gobierno chileno por la marcha que el nacionalista peruano Ollanta Humala convocó para mañana miércoles en la frontera entre ambos países. Los límites territoriales vuelven a preocupar a los gobiernos, pero con una salvedad. La actividad es organizada por la oposición al gobierno de Alan García. De hecho, les exigen que presente la controversia por el límite marítimo ante el Tribunal Internacional de La Haya.
Lo que está haciendo el señor Ollanta Humala es un hecho netamente político de un nacionalismo trasnochado.
Aún no se confirma la presencia de Humala en el lugar. Con o sin el líder nacionalista, la manifestación sería igual, pese a la presión del gobierno de Perú para evitar un posible impas diplomático con Chile, originado esta vez desde la oposición.
El gobierno peruano obviamente es completamente ajeno a este movimiento, a estas personas que están por su cuenta intentando crear un incidente con Chile.
Bolivia, on the other hand, was left without access to the Pacific Ocean and its ports after losing the war with Chile. Today, in commemorating that conflict, Bolivia's President Evo Morales is blaming foreign financial interests for most, if not all, of Latin America's wars.
Estaba revisando que todas las guerras que hubo en Bolivia y en Latinoamérica no han sido guerras provocadas por los pueblos, sino por las transnacionales. Y hace 28 años atrás, un problema de Chile y Bolivia no ha sido un problema de guerra provocado por los pueblos de Chile ni de Bolivia, sino intereses externos. Se han impuesto para crear un problema donde Bolivia, lamentamos muchísimo, que tiene que perder la salida al mar.
Mr. Rockwell, how true is it, what we just heard from Evo Morales, that most of Latin America's wars are caused by foreign financial interests?
Well, I think it's typical for a politician like Mr. Morales that there's some hyperbole attached to that. But I would say that what we don't hear too much in the United States is about the issue of U.S. imperialism and the way that banks and other investors moved the U.S. to get involved in Latin America in the middle of the 19th century, not even discussing the 20th century. So these things are apparent, and they're apparent to people in Latin America, but it's not the only reason.
I think the United States has a very long history about this issue with the Latin American countries. And among the Latin American countries, we have problems with immigration, but I think it's not financial interest. It's problems with economies and with the difference between an economy of one country and another economy that is better. And then the people is looking to have a better life.
Obviously, strong policy is divide and conquer. That's been used. Do you feel, or how do you feel about that?
Well, in my opinion, the United States certainly has used that in the past, but sometimes these conflicts have little to do with the United States and have much more to do with various countries' nationalism. You look at the soccer war between El Salvador and Honduras, this is an instance where the United States was not really involved. This is an instance of immigration, nationalism, national pride. You do have these border disputes between Colombia and Venezuela, between Peru, Bolivia, and Chile. And this is actually, these disputes are based on the idea of national identity in many of these cases, and disputes that trace from the 19th century, claims that some of these countries don't feel have been settled equitably.
Patricia Mercado, Mexico and Central America and its conflicts.
I think we were so worried trying to solve our problems, our immigration problem with the U.S., that we forgot to work with the Central American countries. We have a very big issue in the borders, in the south borders of Mexico, where the police is not respecting the people, where they are violating their human rights. And if you see the conditions where how these people is crossing the border in South Mexico, it's terrible because they don't have even a border to know when is Mexico and when is Guatemala. But when the people cross to Mexico, they have to deal with the police and with the immigration police and with the local police, and all of them are trying to abuse these people.
When we return, we'll see a very unusual beauty pageant and a very unusual beauty queen. For centuries, Latin America has been traditionally an agricultural region where every corner holds its own special charm. It is a continent where the unusual is not unusual, especially when it comes to its folklore and its cultural traditions, as we see in the following report from Colombia's RCN.
Las ovejas de mejor lana y porte de la región fueron las encargadas de lucir trajes típicos de Boyacá y modelar frente al jurado. 20 hermosas y coquetas ovejas se disputaron la corona. La libertadora, quien entregó un mensaje en homenaje a Simón Bolívar, fue la reina. El alcalde de Paipa fue el encargado de la coronación. Negra Linda fue la virreina.
El reinado de la oveja únicamente es la muestra de lo que es la cultura nuestra, de nuestro ancestro, las hilanderas, cómo se hila la lana.
Durante un año la reina podrá disfrutar de los mejores pastares de la región y visitará todos los hoteles de la capital turística.
Tener un evento tan satisfactorio como lo es el reinado de la oveja da para mucho y da para pensar cosas espectaculares y especiales.
Para el 10º reinado de la oveja se espera tener más de 50 candidatas luciendo los trajes más curiosos de Boyacá.
It's amazing to see how every region of Latin America has its own traditions, its own customs, and its own unusual self, like we've just seen. That's all the time we have. I trust you enjoyed today's program. I would like to thank our panel for being with us, Manuel Orozco and Rick Rockwell in Washington, D.C., and Patricia Mercado here in our studios. I look forward to continuing this dialogue in our next program. Thank you for joining us. We would also like to thank American University in Washington, D.C., and the students at the Latin American Media Studies Department who are helping with the research for this program. Join us next time when we take a closer look at Latin America through the eyes of Latin American media. For more information about Pulso Latino and Latin America, log on to linktv.org. I am Marcos Gutierrez. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you next time here on Latin Pulse.
Latin Pulse was made possible thanks to the generous contribution from the John D. and Catherine T. MacArthur Foundation. Pulso Latino ha sido posible gracias a la generosa contribución de la Fundación John D. y Catherine T. MacArthur.
This program is brought to you by Link TV for educational and non-commercial use only. Link TV is the only U.S. network dedicated to global and national news, uncompromising documentaries, and diverse cultural programs. Programs that connect you to the world.